Today I'm going to be breaking down one of my latest tracks that just dropped earlier this month called Sweet Dreams, with the hope that you can understand a little bit more about my process and perhaps you too can make lo-fi songs that sound like this. This is the full project, mixed and mastered and all that, but let's get right into exactly how I made it. So I started this one the same way that I start so many of my tracks, just kind of noodling around on my favorite free piano VST, Labs by Spitfire Audio. I was noodling around on the actual keyboard I've got behind me, and I ended up finding a progression I liked. I think I actually played this one in, so it's a super simple arpeggiating pattern. So straight out of the VST with none of the added effects, it sounded like this. And that was obviously super quiet, so what I ended up doing was kind of the lazy man's way of making it louder. I threw a couple of fruity balances on, which allowed me to bump it up by 5.6 dB. And then after that I put a little RC20 where I had the radio noise type mixed a little bit low with the follow turned up so that it only played the radio sound when the volume of the piano was feeding into RC20. Sort of gave it this like nice high-end texture, but something that followed the notes rather than just a constant background noise, because I added that in later with the rain ambience. And then I switched the wobble to stereo, mix turned all the way up, and I added a little bit of distortion to everything above the sort of low mids here. From there, put a little bit of Valhalla Supermassive, the small and wide preset, pretty much left that alone just to put it in a space, and did a little bit of compression, some side chaining, a little bit of EQing to cut out the low end so it wouldn't be fighting with the bass later on. And then, of course, my favorite 4-band dynamic EQ from TDR Nova. This is an awesome free plugin. Can't recommend it enough, just to sort of tame some of the harsh frequencies, especially on the attack of some of those sort of low mid notes. So with all the effects and everything all put together, I turned the Labs piano into this sound. So you can hear it's got a lot more character like that, but it was still lacking a little bit of body and a little bit of the uniqueness I was looking for. So I ended up layering on this Originals Firewood piano, which is also from Spitfire. So this is a really beautiful VST, particularly because of the organic textures that it has built right in. So here I've got the hammers turned all the way up, which give us the sounds of the hammers actually hitting the strings, a little bit more of the mechanical noises that you hear from a real piano that I think the Labs tends to lack by itself. So I layered this in and sent it to the same mixer track to get all of that same effects, the RC20, the compression. And then together there's sort of like these weird phasing things going on that give it like this almost chorusy effect, which maybe by itself doesn't sound the best, but I ended up liking the way it sounded all in the mix. So this is what those sound like layered on top of each other. And you can really hear the hammers and like the more mechanical noises from the Originals piano. Like on that release, you hear everything coming off, which Labs just doesn't quite have the same way. So I like the way those two combine to give me something a little bit more realistic. And then from there, I wanted to give it a little bit more body, a little bit more of a foundation, so I added a couple of different pads. This first pad here is just basically stripping the chord down into a couple notes at a time. So this one in particular is only 2 notes, sometimes first and the third, root and the fifth, you know, really basic stuff. I basically just looked at the MIDI from what I played on the piano and then figured out what notes fit to sort of round it out. As far as the actual sounds go, the first pad is a patch I made in Vital. It's initially sort of like a slow swelling string sound, but I turned the reverb all the way up and cut the lows out, and then sent that over to the mixer where I really narrowed down to the mids, you know, cut all the lows, a bunch of the highs out, and then drenched it in a really large reverb with Valhalla Supermassive. And then I widened it out a bit with the Fruity Stereo Enhancer, and then, yeah, just sidechained it to the kick and did a little bit more taming of some harsh frequencies here. And then for the second pad, it's actually a serum patch that I made, I think a couple years ago watching In the Mix tutorial. But long story short, this is just another sort of swelling pad that I've got the reverb cranked up on, a lot of the lows cut out of, and it's sent to the same mixer track as the first pad. So with the piano, the pads sort of give it a lot more space and give it a stronger body and foundation here, so you can hear that all together here. So the next element I added as I was sort of building out this loop was this electric piano, which I grabbed from Contact, just one of the free factory selection EPs. And I did some really simple processing. I threw Magic Dice on. It's a randomized delay plugin that I've talked about a few times here on the channel as well. Really cool plugin, super little control. You just sort of hit a randomize button and it spits out some type of randomized delay. So I must have hit it a few times and ended up on something I liked that gave it a little bit of space. And then I boosted the volume a little bit with a Fruity limiter. This EP is playing a sort of like counter melody role against the pianos. So all that was left to add to this loop before I arranged it out was a little bit of bass and then of course drums. So for the bass, I just went with key bass. It's this really nice, super warm, rich, subby, free bass VST. I love it. I just threw it on with its stock settings, didn't change a single thing about it. Mixed the volume way down and then side chained that to the kick as well. Just sort of give it like a really strong low end to sort of build up to. And then for the drums, I went super sparse on this one. I went with like a really warm, round, subby kick, I believe from Mondo Loops. So there's a good thump to it, good body, not a ton of crazy attack, which you can see here in the shape of the waveform. And then for the snares, I just layered a couple of snare sounds, which I also added a bunch of reverb to, as you can hear. And then here I've got sort of like a brush that leads into the snare, which I sort of automate in and out, but I'll get into that a bit. For the hi-hats, I laid down sort of like an almost chugging hi-hat pattern, and then this brushed hi-hat against it. And then I layered in one perk just to give it a little bit of bounce. So altogether, everything that I had in the loop for expanding into more of an arrangement sounded like this. So from here, I started building it out into what I wanted the track to look like energy-wise. A pretty typical arrangement for me will be that it starts at a low energy, builds gradually to the first drop where we hit that first peak, and then the energy sort of falls off, not quite as low as the intro was, but a nice dip in the middle before building to a slightly more energetic second drop, and then a mellow out in the outro. So in the project file, you can sort of see that the number of stems that I have in each section matches that energy profile, because layers make size, make energy, at least in most cases. So as I was sort of laying these things out, I started thinking about what I wanted transitions to feel like, what elements I wanted to enter and exit at certain times, And then, of course, a whole bunch of automation, which I think I'm going to start getting into a little bit of now. So something I did to start this track off, which is a little bit unusual for my productions, was that I opened up with just the pad that sort of swelled into the piano coming in after one measure. So I took the second pad, which was a single note, and allowed that to grow with the channel volume automation, and then had it super wide in the stereo field in the beginning of the intro, and then it narrowed out as we progressed through. And then similarly, I had that first pad, but the second one in the arrangement sort of automate up throughout the beginning of the intro. In the pianos, I actually started with just the lab sound coming in that first measure of instrumentation, and then had that layered textural originals piano swell in throughout the intro to start giving it more body and build that energy up. And then along with that volume automation, I was layering the high and low end of an EQ to sort of widen out what was like a filtered out piano sound. So if we listen to the intro with all of the automation turned on at first, you can get a feel for the way I wanted it to evolve. So once I had sort of decided on the feeling of the intro, I realized that I wanted a few more elements to come in as the energy was growing. So I hunted down a couple of Foley and shaker loops, a few things from some of Mondo Loops packs, and then I also just took little sections from the hi-hat and that more bouncy perk and had them come in right before the drop to sort of help build up the, anticipation or what have you. So right before the drop, you'll notice that I actually cut out the Foley loops, the shakers, the hi-hat, and the perk just to sort of create a gap, because a lot of times you're trying to make an impactful drop, an impactful hit. The best way to do that is to take things away right before the impact, because that way you sort of feel the difference more. Like if I just kept adding, and then the hit happens, it becomes very linear. But by creating let's go this way, so that it becomes very linear, but by creating a section where everything drops out, the difference between here and here is not nearly as much as here and here. So we build, drop, and then it shoots up, and then you got this really dramatic, wide, impactful drop, right? So that was sort of the goal here with these percussive elements that I cut out. But taking their place, I added these sort of like white noise transitions, which I don't even know where I got them, but they're super easy to make. So let me know if you have any questions about that. Love to give you a little rundown. So just a little white noise. And then one little fun thing I added as well were these reverse swells that I printed from the piano itself. I just took one note, threw a bunch of reverb on it, printed it, reversed that, ended up with this sort of swelling sound, lowered it an octave in a double version, and left it in a high octave in this version, and then added reverb to the reverse signal. So it sounds maybe more complicated than it was. I hope that makes sense, but the final product sounds like this by itself. So that's just sort of a good build up into the next section, really, pretty much all the time. It's a great little tool. And yeah, finally, once I had everything sort of arranged out into a full beat, I knew that I wanted guitar on this song to sort of really tie everything together and put that finishing touch on it. So I laid some guitar down. Not really sure if I have anything to say about the actual composition of the guitar part. Honestly, it was just me noodling around until I found a motif that I liked, and then I expanded on it with a few harmonies. But as far as the signal chain goes, I started with EQ to cut out all the low ends, ran it into an amp emulator, the Archetype Plini Electric Sunrise intro preset. I don't think I changed anything about it. From there I put a little more RC20 on this thing, really send it into that lo-fi sphere. Just a tiny bit of wobble, a good bit of distortion, and a little bit of that magnetic sound. Once again, my old friend TDR Nova to sort of tame some of the harsh frequencies that tend to poke out, because honestly I really need to give my guitar a tune-up. It's not the, finest instrument on the planet, but gets the job done. And then the rest of this is really just sort of taming harsh frequencies, and then one really giant reverb that I automate into that middle section where everything drops out, just to sort of give it this huge spaciousness. Let's have a listen to the first drop with everything all together, and then I want to talk about the final element that is unique in the song. That's the keys that I added to the middle here. So this is the first drop. So you can hear that guitar one and the counter guitar down here were sort of call and responsing back and forth a bit. And one thing worth pointing out is that as far as what I was noodling around on the guitar to do, I did end up leaving a good amount of space for this electric piano counter melody and working pretty closely with the rhythm that it was providing. So sometimes the guitar would move with the electric piano, and sometimes it would just leave a nice gap for those accent notes to poke through. That's just a good thing to think about anytime you're laying down new melodies, is really think about what the elements you already have are doing and how you can complement them rather than just stack on top of them. So yeah, the final little section that I think is worth chatting about is this second key melody. I ended up popping in here. Same thing, layered the lab sound with the original's firewood sound. I played this in and then actually doubled the octave, because I can play octave, but definitely not super well. So I did it the lazy way. Don't judge me too hard. And then I actually sent this to a separate mixer track so that I could process it a little bit differently. Same deal with the fruity bouncers. I just pushed the volume up a little bit more. So I was just a little bit more aggressive with the RC20, a little bit more of the noise still on the same follow function. The wobble I think stayed about the same. The distortion I think I cranked up a good bit, and then I added a little bit more of the space to sort of let it fill the slightly more empty arrangement. And then I added one fresh hi-hat loop and a nice little chime sound to the transition. And then finally, coming out of that section, I laid down a nice little guitar harmony that mirrored that first guitar's rhythm super closely, but just was a literal harmony to the first guitar while still having that counter melody guitar dancing around. And that was sort of how I got to that slightly more energetic second drop that I talked about earlier in my arrangement mentality. So I think that's just about everything that I did on this track, pretty much everything I was thinking about, and most of the techniques I was using as far as the production goes. So I'm gonna let this play out. Thank you so much for stopping by. If this video is at all helpful, if you want to see more like this, please think about hitting that subscribe button. We are on the road to 1,000 subscribers, and it would mean so much if you would be one of the first 1,000. Anyway, I'm gonna let this play us out. Thank you guys so much, and I hope I will see you back here next week. Peace. Peace.